Hello Horror Hounds, it's time for us to look at Dario Argento's third film, Four Flies on Grey Velvet. At the time, Argento said that this would be his last giallo movie. The first 10 minutes of this film are like a greyhound out of the traps. We start with a band at rehearsals with Ennio Morricone providing the score and a pastiche of a prog rock rehearsal space freakout, propelling Argento's visual storytelling into overdrive. We get this band jam session interspersed with a montage which shows us that someone has been stalking Roberto, the hero, and the drummer in the band for a number of days. There's space-bending camera work, views from inside an acoustic guitar, another view gazing down the fretboard of an electric guitar as it's being played, a shot the top of the Pops, of all things, would steal. There's a shot in the back of Roberto's car in flashback from his back seat that then, when he stops in traffic, pushes into his rearview mirror so that we can see the man following him in the car behind him in reflection. There's another with a discarded cigarette end in extreme close-up in the foreground of the frame of a shot that shows this same strange stalker figure running off into the distance. A chasing camera whirling around Roberto, pushing into his space, then becoming his point of view, crashing through a succession of red curtains until he finds himself in an abandoned theatre where he confronts his stalker. Here he accidentally stabs the man to death, and then in a box above him lights come on and a figure wearing a creepy sort of child's doll mask takes photographs of the crime scene and soon contacts Roberto with photographic evidence of the murder, not to blackmail him but to drive him insane before killing him. Roberto can't go to the police without implicating himself in the murder, so he must try to figure out the identity of his tormentor as people around him start dying before he himself is killed. Boom! This is the film where Argento lets all of his instincts go wild, run riot, every trick in his arsenal. It seems that anything goes. Maybe it's the close association in the opening of the movie between visual tricks, editing and music that puts the notion in my head, but whereas Cat O' Nine Tails did seem to be striving to be a more formal mystery thriller in its storytelling, Four Flies on Grey Velvet feels more like freeform jazz. Whilst the opening 10 minutes sees this jazz in its most concentrated form, there is more craziness sprinkled throughout the film. These moments do become more drawn out, and it's almost inevitable that with such a frenetic opening, at 100 minutes long, the film does become saggy in 2 or 3 places. Roberto has to be one of the least proactive of Argento's protagonists. He barely searches for the killer. He spends a lot of time waiting and reacting to everything that's happening around him. Some people really don't like Michael Brandon's performance as Roberto. I really like it. I think he plays him with a sort of 70s hippie glam sexuality that seems to me to be completely on point. And I think Roberto's vacuity, his lack of sort of chutzpah, does seem intentional. There does seem to be some commentary in the film about this love generation, this 70s generation of hippies being rudderless and directionless. The gender fluidity and sexual freedom of this love generation plays right into Argento's wheelhouse of concerns and obsessions. Psychosexual confusion and violence brought on by childhood trauma. And whilst Roberto is long-haired and lithe, feminine, his wife, played by Mimsy Farmer, is short-haired and boyish and conservative. The gender norms of the time, the stereotypes, much more recognisable then than they would be now, are swapped in that relationship. And then add to this the character of Gianni. Eventually Roberto hires a private detective to try and find out who is tormenting and stalking him. In my video for Cat O' Nine Tails, we talked about the gay character of Brown and how surprised and impressed I was that Argento had included such a seemingly progressive representation of a gay man in such an early film of his. And what Dario gives with one film, lo, he takes away with another. Gianni is nothing if not a tick box of gay stereotypes, which is a real shame because elsewhere in the film there is a more persuasive and pervasive homoerotic subtext in exchanges and glances that pass between Roberto and one of his bandmates. There is a certain element of, let's call it, gender confusion at the heart of the psychology of the killer in this movie, and perhaps playing devil's advocate for Dario here, he felt he needed a clearly gay character in the mix to help pin down the gender fluidity of many of the other characters. Perhaps he's just got a real tin ear for gay characters and can accidentally write a really decent character in Cat o' Nine Tails and just as easily write a walking stereotype in his next movie. Is it good for 1971 just to have gay characters of any stripe? Is clumsy representation better than no representation? Argento seems intent on having gay men in these films, and I don't know whether you could argue that there's a maturing of his portrayal of them. I don't think there's a straight line from earlier films to later films. I think Gianni's a bit of a blip in this. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say he's offensive, but he's the closest to offensive that we've come so far. It bemuses me why Argento does this. My gut tells me to fall down on the side of it being bold, and representation at this stage is probably good, and an awful lot of it is positive representation, or at least not negative representation. I'm gabbling now. I don't know the answers to this, but it's a common theme in Argento's early movies. It's a knotty, thorny one, and just as with the accusations of misogyny levelled against him, which I don't think are true, I can see why some people would level accusations of homophobia against him. I don't think that's the case. I think that maybe sometimes with the best of intentions, he just writes shitty characters. The mystery at the heart of this, the mystery at the heart of all of them, who is the killer, did have me guessing. I kept guessing. I kept updating my list. My other half guessed really early on, didn't change her guess, and she was right. Unlike Deep Red, Tenebrae, Four Flies on Grey Velvet is not as taut and well-paced as it could have been. Supposedly Argento and co-writer Lucio Cosi came up with all the deaths first and then a plot afterwards to wrap them all up. Whereas with Cat o' Nine Tails, it seemed to be plot first. Certainly with Four Flies on Grey Velvet, it's just an explosion of filmmaking experimentation, and the plot, I wouldn't even say is secondary or tertiary. It's just a reason to get people in front of the camera and the camera rolling. I don't like all of it. There's a really uneasy sense of him trying to inject humour into this film at times, like really forcing it in there. There's a comedy postman character that keeps cropping up that's frankly embarrassing, and there's a running joke of a woman who keeps receiving her neighbour's Swedish porn in the post. Argento's forte is not broad strokes humour. Up until now, he's peppered his films with supporting characters that are there to add levity and comedy thumbnail sketches, and I'm all for those. That's absolutely fine. And in his next film, Profondo Rosso, the humour and lightness is much better pitched, well-tempered, and emanates from the wonderful Daria Nicolodi. We'll talk probably plenty more about her in the next video. Here, the humour is leaden, cringy, and really, with the pacing issues that the movie has, I'd have probably stripped out about 10-15 minutes of this movie, and frankly, all the comedy would go. Like the best of magicians though, Argento has one final card up his sleeve for the finale of the movie. And if the revelation of the mystery is a little flaccid because the plot is by no means of primary importance in the making of this film to Argento, the final few minutes of the film, the final surprise in literally the dying last minutes, is, it leaves me practically speechless. A car crash depicted in such ultra slow motion that the time dilation there renders it fascinating, a thing of utter beauty. It gives us time to study the fracturing and the splintering of the windscreen, and then as the pieces slowly fall away, we get to observe the final seconds of the occupant's life, their reaction and emotions playing out as the camera pushes slowly, relentlessly forwards towards them. The last seconds of life almost plucked out of time and space and allowed to unfurl before us like an elegy to the impermanence of life. It really is something to behold. Good to his word, Argento's next film was not a giallo, but a historical comedy called The 5 Days of Milan, which I will not be reviewing for part of this series. I'm just going to skip over it. I don't think you can get an English language version of it. Anyway, it does seem that after Crystal Plumage, Cat o' Nine Tails and Four Flies, Argento felt he had said and achieved all he thought he could within the giallo template. Luckily for us, he was dead wrong. With the excesses of Four Flies on Grey Velvet out of his system, and probably the experiences of working in a completely different genre for 5 Days of Milan, he returned refreshed to the genre that he helped create, shape and promote. Full of new energy and experience, we'd see him refine everything that he's learnt to date. It seems like the final lesson he had to learn was perhaps restraint. Only slight restraint, mind you, for the maestro of mayhem, but pulling back just a little on the throttle in the aid of focus would pay dividends. His next film, Profondo Rosso, would be his first bona fide masterpiece.